This is Labour Leave, and we thought we'd just have a quick rundown of all the events that have happened this week in Parliament, focusing particularly on the amendments and the key votes that took place on Tuesday. I'm Brendan Chilton, this is John Mills, and we hope you enjoy the discussion this morning. We're going to kick off, I think, really Labour's amendment that was put in, which was to keep us in a permanent customs union with the European Union. John, what do you think of that amendment? Was it a sensible one, good for the country, delivers on Brexit?
Well, I think to be in the customs union but not in the single market, which I understand is the Labour position, really does seem to be a very hard position to sustain. And I'm not surprised that that one went down. I think that there are big problems about us being in the customs union. We can't negotiate deals with any third countries all over the place, in the Commonwealth and elsewhere. It locks us into high tariffs, because the European Union is a pretty protectionist organisation, and I wouldn't have thought this was the way ahead at all.
Well, it does seem to be a bit odd to want to stay in a customs union but not to stay completely in the single market. I mean, what do you think the logic in that is, or is it just a compromise?
Well, I think it's partly a compromise, but I think it's partly because Labour doesn't want to backtrack on the commitment to end free movement, and if we were 100% inside the single market, that's where we would be. So really what Labour's trying to do is to get a sort of half in and half out of the single market, but fully in the customs union. And frankly, this is not Brexit at all. I mean, this is really being stuck in an organisation which pretty well is where we are now, but losing control, losing any voting power in any of the organisation's components, and that seems to be the worst of all worlds, really.
Kind of like a taxation without representation type thing. I mean, it is a very peculiar stance to take, and of course Barry Gardner, who was he still is our Shadow Trade Secretary, once said that to stay in the customs union would be essentially keeping Britain in the position of a vassal state, and it kind of makes redundant his entire position in the Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Trade Secretary. He won't be able to develop any trade policy.
Well, I think there's problems there, but I think the problems more generally with the Labour stance of saying that whatever happens, we've got to avoid no deal. I mean, no negotiation that anybody's going to have, which is sensible, takes off the table the biggest threat that you can produce right at the very beginning.
Can you imagine Bob Crow going in to negotiate with TfL saying, no matter what happens, I'm not going to strike? He just wouldn't do it, would he?
No, I'm sure he wouldn't.
The late Bob Crow.
That doesn't mean that we want no deal.
No.
What we'd like to do is to have a deal which was a fair one between us and the European Union, much better than having the disruption that we may be facing on the 29th of March. But to take it off the table completely really weakens our negotiating position with the European Union. I mean, obviously we're in a bit of a face-off at the moment anyway, but to throw away your best card at this stage in the proceedings seems to me to be exactly the wrong way to go.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think the other amendments we had down on Tuesday was obviously Yvette Cooper's amendment, and just for viewers, her amendment essentially would delay Article 50 until about mid-February, later on in the year as well, if necessary. And this was defeated because 14 Labour MPs voted against it, and I believe 3 frontbenchers abstained. Now, what would have been the problem with her amendment passing? Had it delayed it and kept us in?
Well, I think the problem with delays, it doesn't really solve anything. It's just kicking the can down the road. And I mean, I think in fact we may finish up with having some sort of delay, because what's piling up at the moment is all the legislation that would have to be passed, whatever the outcome of the negotiations. I don't think it's going to be at all easy to get all that done by the 29th of March now. And if we drag on this whole process for another couple of weeks before the next decision is taken in the middle of February, there's even less time. So there may be pressures to extend Article 50 a bit for that reason, but that's different from just extending it
just a generic extension,
just to give more time, because that's not going to make the problems any easier to solve.
I mean, I think it was highly significant that we had some new Labour MPs voting against this amendment. People like Stephen Hepburn from Jarrow. You also had others like Gareth Schnell and Caroline Flint, who represent
Kenneth Barron, I think.
Exactly, and I mean it's changing the view, I think, slowly in the Parliamentary Labour Party, and also to have 3 frontbenchers abstain on this issue, despite Labour saying they're going to support it. I mean, do you think that represents any sort of shift in the party on this, and a move towards becoming a proper Eurosceptic party?
Well, I think the Labour Party is very divided on all this and uncertain about the best way to go. Obviously, we all know that about 70% of the seats that Labour won in the 2017 election had Leave majorities. So there's a huge amount of pressure there to at least go ahead in terms with Brexit. But I think the outcome of all this is one which does show that the Labour Party is divided. It's not by any means united behind anything at the moment, certainly not united behind having a second referendum, for example. And I think what you're going to see over the next couple of weeks or months, if it drags on a bit, is more split votes with quite large Labour abstentions and voting with the government.
Well, it's interesting. Another statistic just to throw in there is I think it's 70% of the top 25 most vulnerable Labour seats have Leave majorities, and the top 25 target seats that we need to win from the Tories have Leave majorities. Now, if you're just a political strategist, you wouldn't be delaying Article 50 with those statistics facing you in any future election. I mean, but given so many Labour MPs did vote for Yvette Cooper's amendment, do you think that suggests in any way that, you know, there are quite a bulk of the PLP that hasn't perhaps still accepted the outcome, or are they genuinely just pushing for a delay because they can't see a way forward at the moment?
Well, I think this just underlies the figures that you've got in the Labour Party, which is about 90% of Labour MPs are pretty firmly in the Remain camp. Probably 80% of Labour Party membership is in the Remain camp, but anything up to 50% of Labour's traditional voters are for Leave.
Yeah.
And this is where the tensions arise, which makes it very difficult for Labour MPs to see clearly a way ahead.
So sort of Labour's Leave vote is wholly unrepresented at the moment in the parliamentary party. And that's something perhaps that the party needs to address in the future. If we're to keep hold of those communities and those voters, we need to articulate their concerns on issues. And otherwise, you know, we could go the way of other social democratic parties in Europe.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there is a real danger of a gulf opening up between the attitudes and values and sort of identity issues in the parliamentary Labour Party and the metropolitan areas of the country and the more traditional working class areas of the Midlands and the North and Wales, where we've got to win seats if we're going to have a Labour government again.
Yeah. Well, moving on to the other ones, I mean, we had the Graham Brady Amendment. Now, this was peculiar because Sir Graham Brady, chairman of the 1922 committee, very rarely speaks in the House of Commons because he's got to be a neutral backbench guy on the Tory side. He put forward an amendment that would have accepted the deal if the backstop, this controversial issue in Northern Ireland, had been removed. But if that doesn't happen, we then go for no deal. I mean, what was the significance of his intervention, do you think? I mean, this is a very respected guy on the Tory side.
I think that this was a very important development, really, because I think what it did do is to provide Parliament with a majority for something which we could go back to the European Union with. I think it also united the Conservative Party in a way which, in terms of just the government management, was very helpful as well. But I think this is quite a realistic stance, really, in political terms. And I think this does provide a good foundation for the Prime Minister going back to the EU. I mean, up till now, the EU's been very intransigent in responding to all this. And I think this is pushing us towards more and more of a last-minute deal or last-minute arrangement coming up, if we can get one through at all. So it's a very high-risk strategy for Europe, being so intransigent. But that's the way they are.
But this whole backstop thing, I mean, it's one part of this withdrawal agreement. There's a whole host of other issues that various Brexit groups, politicians, commentators have said are a problem and unacceptable. Do you think we're not getting too tied down on this backstop issue and forgetting the fact that we've still got to pay £40 billion? It's unclear as to whether freedom of movement's really going to end. We're still going to be rule takers essentially and subject to court decisions. All these other big issues are not really being dealt with because everyone's so hepped up about this border issue on the island of Ireland.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, first of all, £39 billion is a huge sum of money to be paid across the exchanges over quite a long period of time. I mean, this is a massive, massive sum that we're being asked to pay. But I think the other thing to remember is that we've got really nothing agreed on trading terms, and there are all sorts of issues hanging around which could be quite damaging to the UK if they're put forward by the EU. Issues around Gibraltar, around fishing rights, all sorts of things. what the role of the city would be in the future, all that kind of issues. And because we've got the backstop in Ireland hanging over us, because unless we can satisfy the European Union that we've got satisfactory arrangements, they won't agree anything else. We're very, very vulnerable in the talks which are going to have to take place in terms of getting a reasonable deal at the end of the day. So there's a lot more at stake in the withdrawal agreement just simply than the Irish border.
I mean, do you think perhaps some Brexiteers in Parliament are losing sight of this and they're just getting too concerned on this and forgetting the bigger picture?
I think there is a bit of a danger of this. I mean, I think that in the end you probably have to compromise and give something up. And as the European Research Group have said, we're not going to get everything. We've got to make sure we're not so intransigent that we don't get anything. But I think that's the danger that the European Union is running into now, that they're being so tough about the Irish border issue that they're in danger of getting no agreement at all.
Well, the Irish Taoiseach has said that he doesn't want a hard border. Various Northern Ireland politicians have said they don't want a hard border. The British government has said they don't want there to be a hard border, and the Commission has said it too. So the political will is there. It's just that they're not willing to budge to ensure that that happens.
Well, I mean, there was a very interesting intervention a week or so ago, as you probably saw, because one of the officials at the Commission said that, oh, well, if you carry on like this, we are going to finish up with having a hard border in Ireland. And Michel Barnier, who's the main negotiator for the EU, backtracked really strongly on this and was saying, well, we've got to avoid this somehow or other. Yes. But, if that could be avoided, why are we getting trapped in this whole backstop problem? Why don't we accept that, given a reasonable amount of time, we can find some sort of technological solution to the Irish border and get this problem out of the way? I
saw on Twitter somewhere the other day that this whole issue is that every day around 300 lorries pass over the border between north and south, and 80% of those lorries belong to one firm, Guinness. And so this whole European issue is being held up by a Guinness truck, basically. But anyway, moving on to the other amendment, which did pass as well, which was the Caroline Spellman and Jack Dromey one. This was a joint amendment. Jack Dromey, of course, was a very well-respected union official before he became an MP. And what thoughts do you have on his amendment? I mean, on the amendment they put forward, particularly good one. I mean, it's passed, obviously, but it basically rules out no deal.
Yes, it does, but what it doesn't do is to say what it's going to replace it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this was a bit of a cop-out voting for that, to be honest with you, because, I mean, certainly there is a majority in Parliament that wants to avoid a no-deal outcome. And I think we all do. We all think it would be far better off to have spent the last 2.5 years negotiating a deal which could then be smoothly implemented rather than having everything pushed to the last minute. So you can understand why people are against no deal. But, being against no deal is one thing. Coming up with a solution which replaces no deal is another. And actually, I think the Graham-Brady amendment was much more significant in that sense because it did produce an alternative, whereas the Spellman-Dromey one really didn't.
I mean, in all of this, a few weeks ago, we had a situation where the Tory Prime Minister was facing a vote of no confidence. There were talks she'd be out of office. The Tory party was completely split down the middle. And it now seems that within a matter of weeks, the Conservative Party has pretty much united. There are still one or two. And it's actually Labour that's now looking quite wobbly on all this because our position is becoming, I think, increasingly unclear. You've got a lot of people pushing for a second referendum. You've got MPs in the Midlands and in the North saying, actually, we really don't want this. We're arguing to stay in a customs union but not stay in the single market, which would mean we wouldn't have an independent trade policy. And we've got 5 million Labour Leave voters that aren't happy with this situation. I mean, is Labour now in a real danger of becoming so messed up on this issue that we actually suffer electorally on it and we end up giving the Conservatives a nice comfortable lead in the polls as a result?
Well, if you look at the polls, I mean, the last poll I saw showed Labour 6% behind the Conservatives. And, really, bearing in mind the difficulties the Conservatives have been in and the fact that, they're 2 years or so into a parliamentary term, I mean, you'd normally expect the opposition to be well ahead at this stage. So I think the fact that we're still 6% behind is not a good sign at all that the strategy that the Labour Party has pursued over the last few months has been successful. I mean, I understand why the Labour Party is in lots of difficulties because of the reasons we discussed earlier on, but I must say I'd feel more comfortable if Labour had a more coherent strategy to offer to the country than it has at the moment.
I mean, it's unlikely that this would happen, but if Labour were to come out for a full, proper, they call it a hard Brexit, I just call it a proper Brexit, do you think we'd take a lead in the polls? Do you think we'd quickly be ahead of the Tories?
Well, I've always thought the best outcome is to have a free trade deal outside the customs union, outside the single market, so you're not half in, half out, which the European Union hates, and then have no tariffs, so the trade would continue, and then cooperation on all the various issues of terrorism and all the other things where clearly we've got a common interest. And if the Labour Party moves to supporting that kind of an outcome, I think a lot of people would feel very relieved. Now we've got to get there, and I think it is possible that what will happen is that we will finish up with no deal or something that, a managed deal which isn't a full one.
Yeah.
But in the end, over the next period, we will move towards having a free trade deal along the Canadian lines, which I think in the end would be the best outcome. So I think there's grounds for some optimism in the long term as to what the outcome's going to be. But I think we're going to go through a bumpy road till we get there.
And of course that will have impact on the Labour Party's standing in future elections as well, because the biggest issue of the day, Brexit, and most opinion polls show that most voters are not clear on where we as a party stand on the issue, and no party's ever won an election or done well when voters have not understood the party's position on a key issue.
I think that's right. If what you do find is the Conservatives coalescing around a strategy probably not a million miles away from the Graham Brady one, and Labour still advocating possibly
Halfway,
the Norway option or a second referendum, very heavily split, that's not going to help us.
No. Okay, well, we've had lots to talk about, and we will have more to talk about because we've got more votes coming up towards the end of this month, and I'm pretty sure we'll have more in February, but hope this has been interesting for you, and thank you very much for joining us, and we'll tune in again soon.